and welcome to the December 10th edition of the Bubb Report. This week, we take a deep dive into the pages of the 2024 Estimates of Revenue and Expenditure, which will inform Grenada's 2024 fiscal year. Dennis Cornwall, MP, Grenada's finance minister, presented a $1.6 billion budget, which the government expects will be fully financed from $104.6 million in grants, $56.5 million in loans, and $258.4 million through revenue collection.
It provides for a total expenditure, including principal repayment, of $1,656,356,499. The overall budget summary is as follows. Recurrent revenue, $1.2 billion. Total grants, $104.6 million. Recurrent expenditure, $901.4 million. Capital expenditure, $419.5 million.
On the expenditure side of the budget, the administration yet again allocated a large chunk to the nation's struggling healthcare sector at $117.9 million, $136.1 million to infrastructure development, and $121.5 million to national security. Other sectors received increases in allocations including housing and social services, agriculture, and youth.
Mr. Speaker, on the domestic front, due to our strong economic management, Grenada has demonstrated impressive resilience in 2023. The economy is estimated to expand by 5.5% this year, 1.9 percentage point more than the 3.6% projected at roughly the same period last year, fueled mainly by the public and private sector construction and continued support and recovery in tourism.
Yes, transformation words, Mr. Speaker. They put up words. You get 100% of words. Zero for implementation, project implementation. Zero. We want percentages and performance benefiting people. That's the mark.
Leader of the opposition, Dr. Keith Mitchell, in his rebuttal to the 2024 budget presentation, argued that the budget presents no new ideas and it is simply a continuation of his administration's policies in a number of areas.
What this House and the population was subjected to on Monday was a disjointed, inarticulate, rambling, confused journal of the NDC first year and a half in government, which focused entirely on the successful programs that the NNP established and initiated, while at the same time attempting to malign the previous NNP government. They did not have the conscience to say it was NNP who did this. But the people not sleeping and the God is not sleeping.
To what extent will the state be able to finance the initiatives announced in the budget against the backdrop of the country's fiscal resilience framework and debt management strategy? We hear from our experts who will make sense of the budget's ability to meet its expectations. Later in our program, we will debrief Martine Power's blockbuster podcast, The Empty Grave of Maurice Bishop, which just streamed its 7th and last episode. Powers joins us to discuss her findings and what those findings means for the decades-old mystery of the whereabouts of the remains of Maurice Bishop and his cabinet colleagues, whose remains were never given the dignity of a proper burial in Grenada. We welcome our guests, Chester Humphrey, labor consultant and former Technical and Allied Workers Union President General; Martine Powers, audio journalist with the Washington Post; Kenny John, President of the Grenada Chamber of Industry and Commerce; and Ambrose Phillip, retired public servant and public policy analyst. Here now is our host, Dr. Kellon Bubb, with this week's editorial titled Holding Parliamentarians and Cabinet Ministers Accountable Post the Pay Hike. I am Rion Charles. Thank you for joining us.
A pleasant good morning to our viewers and listeners. And first, let me sincerely apologize for the late start today because we were having some technical issues with some of our guests on the login process. And when technology fails, it does fail. But we want to get right into the conversation. And this week's conversation involves doing an analysis of the 2024 Grenada estimates and of revenue and expenditure, and what it would mean for the macroeconomic framework of the country, what it would mean for the private sector framework of the country, and what it would mean for the labor climate in the state of Grenada. And here to make sense of this next year's fiscal year are Mr. Kenny John, who is the president of the Grenada Chamber of Industry and Commerce, Mr. Ambrose Phillip, who is a maritime economist and a very sharp-eyed analyst of Grenada's macroeconomic and fiscal framework, and Mr. Chester Humphrey, the former president of the Grenada Senate, as well as the former president general of the Technical and Allied Workers Union, and an active and passionate friend of the labor movement, and currently a labor consultant. Gentlemen, welcome to this week's edition of the Bubb Report.
Good day. Good day.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bubb. It's always a
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Bubb, to you and your...
My good friend sat opposite to me in my earlier days as a active trade unionist, Brother Ambrose Phillip. And of
Yes.
course, John, you reminded him very well.
Yes.
One of the standard individuals in the insurance industrial business. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, and I'm so happy. Yes, I'm so happy to have you gentlemen come in today to discuss the budget. I think it's a very important conversation to have, gentlemen. Now, gentlemen, I want to begin big picture in looking at the macroeconomic framework of this budget. I will begin with you, Mr. Phillip. Mr. Phillip, looking at the macroeconomic framework against the very important ability of the state to not only balance its budget, but to be able to manage its debt obligations. How does this budget fit within that framework?
I don't think we have to go too far. You did have an IMF mission here not too long ago, and they, in fact, did give the government and gave the economy a glowing report. It is not just looking at the budget alone, but you have to look at what the Ministry of Finance has called the budget documents. In other words, you are looking at 2 or 3 other documents, starting off with the throne speech, going to the medium-term debt strategy, and going to the 2-year economic outlook. There are a number of interesting things, but in terms of the question that you have asked, whether or not the budget is a viable budget, whether it is going to be realized, by and large, I'm inclined to say yes. To be honest, I tried listening to the budget. Unfortunately, I was on the road during the presentation. And that's another thing. We can't call this budget business a debate. It's not a debate. It is a presentation. And then the rest of Parliament becomes a pecan old talk. It becomes very good fodder for people like Christy Riggs and my friend Peters to do plays. I don't believe that we're serious in Parliament when we come into that kind of stuff. So let's call it a presentation and leave it at that.
Okay, absolutely. Mr. John, as the private sector representative on the panel, the macroeconomic framework, because the macroeconomic framework would be extremely crucial in respect of fostering continued private sector thriving. Yes, not only private sector growth, but the state has to provide that enabling environment. But the macroeconomic framework must be such that that it would be amenable to the continued growth of the private sector.
Thank you. Pleasant good day to everybody, particularly Mr. Ambrose Phillip and also Mr. Chester Humphrey. Greetings to all. Greetings also to the audience today. I'm inclined to follow the sentiments of Mr. Ambrose Phillip, in particular for the business sector what is important is continuity, stability. And the alluding to the fact of the recent presentation by the leader of the opposition, I think we see aspects of political maturity, that when a new government comes in, it doesn't abandon everything that has happened before, while trying to put obviously its own stamp and its own ideology, also its own forward thinking to that aspect of it. From a macro end, stability brings into play a number of things. We have to be certain of what I would refer to as public administration. That is perhaps the most and the biggest key to how well we do. Public administration, not only from an efficiency point of view, but a cost-effective point of view. The praise of the recent IMF mission gave the government some kudos in what it has done so far. I believe you cannot simply in 1 year look to see whether or not the policies of this government, economic macro or micro, is succeeding because it has just started. Signs so far good, and the business community generally feels sort of at ease to continue and planning and therefore invest.
What enabling policies has this government articulated that you believe creates that enabling environment for the business community?
Well, I think the business community is always mindful of its trends in, for example, healthcare. We have been talking about through history, recent and past, about why don't we have a better health system. I believe this government seeks to address what it sets out to do from the beginning, and therefore addressing healthcare, it has a lot of implications. There are a lot of people who would love to return home, but quite frankly are worried about how you do it, where the healthcare is very much absent. Stability comes from the possible economic activity that these people would bring to our country. And these are Grenadians. I'm not talking about foreigners here. I'm talking about Grenadians in particular. Economically, while we have just come through a turbulent pandemic where every country in the world has seen ridiculously adverse situations that many of them have not been able to come out of. We have stabilized somewhat, although there are aspects of the economy that still needs some shoring up, and that we will talk about, I guess, as this day goes through. Hello?
Senator, I still call you Senator Emeritus, given your role as the most recent former president of the Senate. You no longer sit in that position, sir, but you still offer very important insights in respect of your experience in labor. Same question, the macroeconomic picture of the budget. How do you see it from where you sit in the labor environment?
I associate with the overall comments of Ambrose. The truth of the matter is the budget, in terms of its technical outline, has not varied much. I mean, these things meet certain standard requirements. Remember, there are no laws in place which imposes a great amount of restraint and responsibility on politicians and the way in which they do what they do. I have not determined any major deviation from the last 3 or 4 or 5 budgets. So in that sense, the budget as presented is fairly consistent. It has, in fact, been premised on a certain degree of stability, and I think that's what Mr. John was referring to when he says the private sector has certain basic concerns. And of course, the issue of economic stability, its ability to predict fairly where business is going to go, what opportunities there are for investments, and whether or not the risks which present themselves for the business sector is worth taking. So when you have an overall macroeconomic situation that is stable with very little variances, the business community, especially the business community that we have, I don't want to speak disparagingly of them, but it's a comprador. Our economy is essentially run by a comprador class, aligned to international capital in respect of certain areas of economic endeavor, namely the leisure business and tourism. Beyond that, there's nothing really wowish, to use an Ali Gill term, which he used in some elections ago. He didn't see a wow. And I understand that to mean there's been nothing really overwhelmingly present. I mean, the framework is all the same. There are some, when you go down to the micro situation and when you go down to aspects of the labor market and how the wealth is redistributed in relation to aspects of the labor market, then there are some things we can get into. So, for example, minimum wage is one such aspect that we can get into. But overall, I think what the budget represents is continued stability in the context of the limitations of an economy that is on the periphery of capital, an island economy, subject to the vagaries of weather issues, subject to the vagaries, like unlike St. Vincent, of course, who have had just not weather issues, meaning hurricanes and floods and high wind and so on, but they've also had some geological, geothermal issues with a volcano and so on. I'm saying outside of those, and outside of any grave crisis in the international capitalist system, I think the budget would meet its performance parameters, provided, of course, that the CBI program remains undisturbed. I know there are storm clouds on the horizon for such a project.
Yeah.
All indications so far, based on its performance indices, the amount of money coming in by what I would call, well, I won't want to call it passport investments, neither did they mean it.
Well, they call it investment migration now. That's the that's the new term.
Yes, get a more acceptable term. If there's nothing untoward, and signs all indicated that that source of funds for the state has performed well in the last period and is anticipated to improve its performance, I think that the main parameters and objectives of the budget would be met. So stability is my reading of the thing. As I say, I see nothing of a major shift in the economic strategy being pursued. We are basically doing maintenance. And the question will be who maintains better than the next. But I see nothing of a massive transformational nature. I have not seen a massive, significant shift in how the economy is going to perform and what investments we're making in the economy to gain that kind of performance. We still have inherited structural unemployment of a fairly high degree. That is still there. We are still subject, as I say, a lot of what we do depends on a lot of, in the old days, they used to call it grant and aid. We now have, I think, a different name for it, but essentially it's the same. Yes.
Mr. Philip, I'm going to bring you in here. Now, in your last appearance on the program, sir, you did an extremely surgical analysis, and I believe our viewers and listeners were left satisfied that in as much as, and I'm talking now of Budget 2023, in as much as you were able to articulate the positive virtues that the budget would bring to the state, one of the concerns you had then was the financing of the budget. And based on the conversation you had with us last year, it would appear as if your predictions came through, because towards the end of the fiscal year, the state returned to the Parliament to have a supplementary appropriation done which is normally done. You do have these supplementary appropriations, but that supplementary appropriation was meant to finance certain aspects of the functioning of the state machinery towards the end of this fiscal year. Looking at this budget, the Minister of Finance makes the point in his address, in his budget speech, that this budget will be fully financed. Do you agree with the proposition that the budget will be fully financed?
You're asking me to be a prophet. I think that the conditions are there for the budget to be financed. However, if you look at, well, let me say that over the last 2 years, the Grenadian budget has become $1 billion exercise,
Yes.
in terms of the revenue collection. We were not at $1 billion prior to 2023. However, expenditure has risen to match the projected income. And one needs to ask oneself, where has that come from? In other words, I have looked at the budget outturns and the summaries of the budget over the past 7 years. And in fact, 5 or 6 years ago, we were at revenue under $700 million. And now we are projecting $1.2 billion in revenue, exactly where it is coming from. Yeah. Not only that, but you will see that for the first time, the current account surplus is going to exceed $300 million. Now, there has been some creative accounting in this, because on the one hand, you have shifted some CBI income from what may have been classified otherwise before, and you have put it on the recurrent revenue side. So you end up with collections of $1.2 billion. But objectively, expenditure has risen to meet that. Another paradox of the budget is that with the passage of time, the bigger the budget gets, is the larger the safety nets improve or increase. In other words, are we tackling the endemic poverty in the country? And it would appear to me that the answer is no. Remember, about 6 or 7 years ago, we were talking about poverty rates in excess of 30%. How much has it moved from that? During the election campaigning, we heard a lot of licks about the money programs and so-called safety nets of the prior administration. What have we seen now? We have in fact seen a significant expansion of those so-called safety nets. The Imani program, for example, whether it is going to be re-engineered, remodified, call it what you will, is going to increase by $14 million. The seed program is going to increase by another significant amount. In addition to which, and you see, these are paradoxes that we need to understand. You also have to be careful as to what figures you are dealing with. 3 or 4 weeks ago, a senior official in the Ministry of Finance was on a radio program where the matter of the unemployment rate came up. And his position on the unemployment rate at that time was 16%. In the budget, we are now hearing that it is 12%. So objectively, you are not too sure what to believe. You have to link the question of unemployment with the question of poverty and with the question of what is called the safety net programs of the government. All right? So if we are talking about stability, we are stably marking time. And I don't know that we are making genuine progress for the ordinary people in this country. It might be an excellent environment for Brother Kenny, for Brother John and his business cohorts, but I am not too sure that that is the case in respect to the ordinary people. Yes, you have some relief programs, whether it is housing, well, the 500 housing program, excellent idea. the WASH program, I believe, is going to be truly transformative if we are going to be able to solve disputes and issues that are likely to arise out of that, particularly when so many villages and so many parts of this country have common yards, where you have 1 acre land and you have about 25 houses on it, because everybody put up a chupa, put up a little thing to live. These are going to be issues to be dealt with. Fortunately, we started off with a pilot, and hopefully we will learn from that.
That's a very interesting observation you made there in respect of because I heard that particular official in articulating that unemployment rate as against what was articulated in the budget. But Senator Humphrey, I'm going to bring you back here if you want to add something concerning to what Ambrose.
Look, I mean, all the points that Ambrose are making are bang on. But the only how we will solve these problems or begin to tackle them in any significant way is that there has got to be significant investment in the economy to create jobs. Unless you don't create jobs, the major program here has to be job creation. Else you will be dealing, because remember, it's becoming more and more difficult to migrate, right? Because of the imposition of new visa requirements and so on. I mean, just the cost of getting a visa to go to Canada right now is phenomenal, right? And so that whole question of unemployment can only be addressed with a vigorous expansion of the economy. And where would we, in other words, strategically, I think the question has got to be, and there's got to be an open debate. How are we going to go about doing this expansion? Where would we push the economy to? What is our best bet for creating jobs in the short run? I know we have this nostalgic connection with agriculture, but the fact of the matter is agriculture cannot in any significant way dent the unemployment problem, right? And people are not, young workers are not attracted to agricultural work simply because of the backward technological nature of this work. The basic instrument in our agriculture is the same instrument used 400 or 500 years ago. So we are losing the war of productivity in all areas. Our methodologies for doing things are backward, and therefore the cost of doing things is high, and therefore we fail to attract a lot of investment in the various sectors. And that's the problem that we have. Unless we solve that problem, right, we will not be able to tackle unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. And now as our population is aging, we have all kinds of issues, including the social security problems that we inherit by failure to address and make amends to the NIS. We took too long to do this. Now that pensions have been restored, there are serious implications for how the state is going to tackle that in the immediate future. And I see no immediate signs of how this is going to be done. I mean, yes, as a worker representative, the 1958 pension is the best thing in the world. But quite frankly, is that sustainable? And for how long can we do it? How long can we allocate these resources? Bearing in mind that there's tremendous pressure on several streams of state revenue, mainly the Citizenship by Investment Program. We don't know when Western countries, the OECD, will completely dismantle this. They have begun to, as they have done with the offshore financial services, right? They have made it impossible for us to make a living from the export of basic commodities because they've changed up the rules in international trade to our disadvantage. And so there has to be a conversation of how we're going to expand this economy, how rapidly we will do so, and where we should do so. My own view is, from looking at the problem, is that tourism presents the best bet for doing this. But because we don't have an integrated approach, for example, the whole question of land use, you can't have a situation right now in our prime hotel belt, right? We have squatting communities coming over the Montrose Ridge. Now, the two things can't coexist. You can't have hotels that provide a leisure service that charge $8,000 a night. And when the guests look, there's a lot of squatter settlements coming over the hill. These squatter settlements, there are no running water, there are no toilet facilities. So when it rains and in these pit latrines, so there's a whole integrated approach on development that we must have this debate. We can't just do in the maintenance that we're doing. We have to think strategically of how do we change this economy in the face of the new international division of labor, right? In the face of certain realities of labor shortages, the fact that the youth population in this country have they have no attraction to the remnants of the plantation economy. And to ask them to go in country and do that kind of robust, hard, difficult manual agricultural work, it's not going to happen, right? So there's a whole set of conversations we must have other than just looking at broad macro situation, because as I say, all that has been done in the last 10 to 15 years and will continue to be done is just maintenance on the basis of certain technical constraints imposed on us by the World Bank and the IMF and so on. And I don't know that can deliver the kind of development that we justly desire and that we need.
Let me bring back Mr. John and Mr. John. What I hear both Mr. Philip and Comrade Humphrey, Comrade Chester saying here is that there must be an impetus on the private sector to be able to absorb a lot of our citizens who would be hard pressed to depend on themselves. In other words, to get out of the type of entitlements, to use a sort of conservative word here, that government provides, which Mr. Philip has indicated as expanded. How does the private sector come in to absorb a lot of the employment that would be needed by the citizens of the country? Because let us be real, the government cannot employ every citizen in the country. Certainly can't.
Definitely, Kellon. I think the conversation thus far is very interesting, but very true. To put it in short way, Grenada needs to get into business. So right now, Grenada is not in business, and we have not been in business for quite some time. To put it in a more colloquial way, a two-wheel drive vehicle will never be able to do what a four-wheel drive vehicle can do, simply because from the onset, it was not built to do it. Likewise, the economy. There are many issues and aspects of our economy that does not have the infrastructure. We, despite, for example, being the first in the English-speaking Caribbean to create a IXP exchange, which is call it the not sexy thing in terms of technological and data in particular. Grenada has that, but we have not been able to monetize that. We have to have a conversation with everyone about how do we facilitate the rest of the world. And Senator Humphrey is right in terms of looking at non-traditional means. But I want to stick a pin there and talk about one traditional mean that we all but somewhat abandoned. In 1843, nutmeg was introduced to Grenada. In 20 years' time, it will be 200 years. Grenada in its glory day, 20% of the world's production in nutmeg, etc. We have long lost that second place to Indonesia. Well, who was always the first, but many other countries, India and so on included. The point is, we have not been able to export just one manufacturing stage further than a raw bean. So not even grinding the nutmeg, which is not a huge investment in technology. However, a simple stage. I can name 3 different types of operations where nutmeg is vastly used: food preservative, medicine, yes, and pharmaceuticals, yes, pharmaceuticals and cosmetics, Having said that, the paradigm shift in terms of transformation, and just to make a point, for me, transformation is not a destination. It is actually a process. And we have to understand and get our feet and whole body into the process of transforming the economy. And everything that was said before regarding what is done with social services, Grenada has the highest and most extensive social services in the Eastern Caribbean. We are by far the largest supplier. And you're right. Is that sustained? First, structure, business infrastructure. We are in a modern world with an IT world. And that's why I started speaking about the hospital and what you call the teaching hospital. But it dovetails off an existing issue dealing with tourism. We have not defined what our tourism product is, whether it's stayover or it's medical tourism. We haven't really defined it, or food, etc. You see, what we have now is things happening in pockets, and I say happening specifically because it's not coordinated, it's not cohesive. And in order for us to move this economy and then likewise create jobs in the private sector, that enabling environment needs to be. We do not have a mechanism for funding among the private sector. Venture capital, that doesn't exist. Banking, we're in serious issues despite Grenada having the largest savings in the ECCB union, ECCB monetary union. We are still stifled as to what could happen. That's because we passed, and it really hurts me to say this, but that whole FATCA idea where somebody else has imposed a mechanism on us, but it's not returnable. So the access to money, the access to underwriting of loans for businesses is stymied. However, this is what we're finding. There are other countries in the Caribbean right now who are getting access to our economy. And they're not coming in here to develop a part ownership. They're coming for the extraction of resources. So we don't use our own businesses, and therefore we don't develop. Accountability when expense is being expended is important. Structure, business structure. And we can go on and talk about our tax system, etc., etc. But we have to connect the dots. Tourism, in the short run, is the first, I think, in terms of its ability to get us over the hump. But what type of tourism do we want? Do we want the same as Barbados or St. Lucia, which is a little more like mass tourism? Or do we want a higher quality? Grenada is showing signs of going in that way, but yet we haven't defined what that is. I hope that gives a little insight. I would love to talk about that more.
I want to follow up on that enabling environment. Everybody talks about the enabling environment. You heard several of the MPs on the government side articulate that view in their debate on the budget. But can you talk about specific policy initiatives that you believe this current administration has implemented or intends to implement that would create that enabling environment? And I say this against the backdrop of the challenges of doing business in Grenada. And certainly while as you indicated, we are starved for private sector growth in many respects, the doing business environment in Grenada still leaves a lot to be desired. Would you agree?
I agree. It's horrible. I mean, the private sector, the chamber has tried and continues to try every year to run a number of programs to educate, particularly our small and medium-sized businesses. Throughout the world, small and medium-sized businesses make up the majority, but we have a handicap. Most of our small and medium-sized businesses are not even registered. So they're not structured in that they cannot say that I have a tax account and that I operate in a formal environment. And therefore, there has been nothing done in the last 40, 50 years to structure government's willingness or exercise to actually structure and promote private sector development among that. we find ourselves today what I would call the barbecue pit machinery. Somebody sets up a barbecue stand here, two steps down the road, another one, because it is felt, without actually analyzing what is the income, without actually understanding what are the inputs. But I think by and large, a way to help that situation is through public administration. Our public administration effectiveness, efficiencies is woefully inadequate. There is very little accountability in the structures that are there. Procedures, policies, workflows, work rotation. And by every measure, the aspect of reporting that allows it to actually be accountable. So somebody comes in, sign in the morning, and then they go and do their own thing, which is not recorded, but yet the tax dollars of the country have to pay for that.
Yeah.
And if we want to talk about enabling environment for business, it starts there, because a lot of the issues that the public faces and private sector faces is dealing with these same officers. If they don't have a mindset of service to enable, and if we just take one example, the developed countries, developing countries, and those of the East, I'm talking about the Far East. If you look at Singapore, even if you look at South Korea, there is a cohesion with the private and public sector working to develop the country. In Grenada, it's much separated. It's us and them. And it should not be so, because everyone benefits when they work together. But we have to become aware of it. There is an absence of awareness of that reality to improve productivity. If they're enabling environment and to actually start businesses, it's horrible. It's horrible for a person who is trying to set up a business, a small business. You have to go about 4 different places to get your paperwork. And there is not even an educated aspect of it where somebody puts you sit down and say, this is the reality of setting up this business. Construction, it is, there is no what I would call structuring. Construction industry, for example, is entirely willy-nilly. Anybody could do it. Anybody could set up shop and decide to become a contractor, but there are growing cases in the courts right now where people are being sued for sending their money back home to build a property, or even ourselves. You pay somebody, they said it would be 3 days for that job, and all of a sudden they come for 1 day, half day the next day, and you don't see them, and they're asking you for money. So there are things in our society that creates that enabling environment, and government has to lead the charge. And by that
Absolutely.
I mean
So
in our public administration awareness of how we effectively use the money of the state.
that accountability piece there, it's so critical. Mr. Philip, I want to bring you back, and I'll bring back I'm not sure, Ambrose, you want to add anything to what our brother John indicated here? Yes.
Let me comment on what I about before. There is a
Yes.
saying, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there.
Take you there. Correct.
And that's where we are at. We are on any road because we don't know where we're going. Chester is absolutely correct. We are not going to restore agriculture. We have a brilliant program now about planting spice. Planting 1 spice tree in your backyard is a waste of time, because then you have collection problems afterwards, harvesting and collection problems afterwards. So, and you're absolutely right. Our nutmeg production, we've declined from number 2 or whatever you were in the world to number 7 or 8 at this point in time. People who were not in nutmeg production 20 years ago are producing more than us at this point in time. And you're not going to get old people like me going up the hill and going down the valley to connect no nutmeg. That is out of the question. It's not going to happen. So we have to change the model. We have to find a different way. Forget about productivity. As Kenny and my good friend from Labour knows, that is non-existent in this country. And we gave productivity issues no regard. But notwithstanding our concerns about productivity, notwithstanding the government's own concerns about implementation, we go around giving Christmas bonuses and gratuities. So what kind of signal are we sending to our workers? We give ourselves massive increases in the parliament of the country. Right? And we're not talking about productivity. Is the job of a minister a full-time 8 to 4 job or a 24-hour job? Right? We give ourselves what? By the standards of the ordinary man amounts to significant increases. What is the justification? What is the rationale? And we ain't taking no step-by-step approach to this thing and always whoop overnight. I agree that the question of paying people to take care of your grandmother, your old aunt, or whatever it is, $600 and $700 a month is a joke. But we've jumped it up to 12 to 15. Should a step-by-step approach have been considered? Huh? But let's get back to this question about we don't know where we're going. Our focus has not been on the productive sectors in this country. What kind of goods are we going to produce going forward? Are we going to produce stuff that you can put in a bag, whether it is ground spices or nutmeg hot sauce or whatever it is, or are we going to be producing services? The one thing that we seem to have done very well in the past is to export people. And maybe we have a comparative or absolute advantage in exporting people because the people that we generally exported to the diaspora all seem to have done well. We have an opportunity on our doorstep where, in fact, we can reverse a trend that has been occurring over the past 15 plus years. Guyana. We're sitting back now and looking at this dispute between Guyana and Venezuela. But I like the Americans. National interests, first and foremost. Do we have an opportunity in the Guyanas? Do we have an opportunity in the Essequibo? The kind of stuff, Guyana is now ranking seventh in the world in respect of natural gas and petroleum reserves. So yes, there is this global move to phase out or to substitute for carbon-based fuel production, but it's not going to happen overnight. I ain't see Saudi Aramco going anyway. I ain't see the Kuwait investment fund disappearing overnight. I ain't seen Qatar and them shutting down oil industries. Right? You think the US, what it is, the US South Command or wherever it is, would have go down to Guyana if they figure that oil will be of no value tomorrow? The answer is no. But Guyana has less. Guyana has less than 3/4 billion people, right? A lot less than that. They have lost skilled people over the years, and maybe this is an opportunity that we should look at. As a matter of fact, coming to think about it, one of the Farrell economists of Trinidad, 25 or 30 years ago, in fact, did suggest that we should all leave these rocks and consider going to Guyana and Belize. And Guyana, since then, has now established that there are significant petroleum reserves there. Maybe we should be repositioning ourselves to serve the Guyanese economy from a CARICOM point of view. I'm talking about Grenada alone, right? Say what you want. Our Tobal Duras, Buzz Butler, and a number of other heroes service the oil industry in Trinidad. Right? Our people built the underground system in London. We ran the NHS, the National Health Service in England. Right? So we seem to be good at exporting brains. And maybe we need, in terms of going forward, this might be a template going forward. There's one indication that we are trying to change something, but it has not been concretized. And that is the whole question of the government's announced intention about reviewing the school curriculum, reviewing what it is that we are teaching children. So far, the talk has been on introducing them to a wider range of skills, but they are talking about skills like using your hands. Skills in the modern world call for using your brain. Your hand is to put food in your mouth, nothing else. So can we concretize that so that we know exactly what it is that we are talking about? Other than that, objectively, I mean, we're spinning top in mud.
I like that you reference Guyana here. It's such an important juxtaposition against the backdrop of what's happening there now geopolitically. But I will get to this with Senator Humphrey. Senator Humphrey, is there anything you wish to add here? You have as someone who works in the labor movement.
I want to get a little bit more granular.
Yes.
Ambrose triggered the discussion in
Yes.
respect to, and he singled out the emoluments of parliamentarians and the minimum wage. To be quite frank with you, I support the last review done by the government and the award it has made in respect of both the minimum wage, and I have some issues with the minimum wage schedule and how it was done. There are some significant, in my view, there's some significant defects in it. But I support what has been done, and I believe that the emoluments given to members of parliament, right, is fair. It is ultra modest, in my view. I don't think that the award could be deemed to be massive in any way. I think the award has been very conservative and it is fair. And let me go through that for a moment. We deem Parliament to be one of the highest, if not the highest institution in the land. The work of Parliament or the legislature is to pass laws for the good governance, peace, stability, and progress of the community living within the state of Grenada. That's the role of Parliament, to pass laws. And therefore, what is the value we attach to the work that Parliament does? Passing laws for the good governance, which covers every aspect of life of members of this community in the state of Grenada. You have a situation in which there are parliamentarians who earn less in remunerations than the basic pay of the regular Imani. That's a fact. And I know it because I have been there. There are parliamentarians, members of the House of Representatives, and members of the Senate who reside in the other branch of government, namely the executive, who are paid not 1 cent for the work that they do. If you are a member of the branch of government referred to as the cabinet, you get not 1 cent for your parliamentary duties. And you are elected by the people. So that the basic $800 and $900 paid to an Imani makes more money than a member of parliament. The only time you receive a remuneration when you're in parliament is if you belong to the opposition bench. And then what is the pay there? The pay there is $1,200 a month. And since 2013 to now, there has been absolutely no adjustment to the remuneration of parliamentarians. None. I served in parliament for 23 consecutive years as Labour representative. When I demitted office in February of 2013, my pension was $435 a month. Come on. It was $435 a month. I entered parliament when senators were paid around $600. I'm talking now about the value of the work that you do. The value of passing laws. Every law passed in this country in the last 30 years, every single bit of legislation, whether it's taxing legislation, whether it's legislation concerning land and titles, whatever legislation, whether it's criminal legislation, every single piece of legislation passed in the Parliament of Grenada in the last 30 years, I had something to do with it. And for 22 of those years, the pension I received was $435. And Brother Philip, I can't disagree with you more. I cannot disagree with you more. Right? That you have to treat, you see, let's understood how Parliament worked. Before 1951, Parliament was seen, the representation in Parliament was seen as a civic duty, because Parliament was constituted by representatives of the plantocracy and the merchants appended to it. So Parliament was populated by the property class. They had large estates and they had large commercial businesses. So they didn't need any funds. Besides which, they made sure that they govern in respect of their own interests. The vast majority of the population that had no parliamentary representation and very little civil and civic rights, right, were ordinary poor working people. When the 1951 revolution took place and universal adult suffrage was attained, and the vast majority of working people, Black Grenadians, now had a right of representation in the political process, they then came to Parliament. So who came to Parliament is the poor and the unpropertied. So parliamentary salaries had always been viewed as civic duty. So you give a little, because the people who held that power did not depend, or there was no dependence on an income, because the income came from other sources. Right? When Parliament was constituted by a different class, and you have the working class now in Parliament, you can't expect to pay them pittance. And in all of these instances, for those who are serving in the cabinet, the other branch of government, they got absolutely no pay for Parliament. None. So let's get this straight. The figures, look, $5,000 per month for a parliamentarian, quite frankly, is no money at all. The income of the, I represent workers in electricity and other places, and I know what income salaries are. And remember, that income decides your pension. You know, as I told you, my pension after 23 years of consecutive service in the Parliament of this country was $435 a month. What an insult! But I accept it because that is what it is. But things have to change, and I salute the current government for having the willpower to change it. Right? And I challenge anyone in an open debate, or whether or not what has been set, in fact, what has been set in trend is modestly low. When you look at the value of the work done by parliamentarians in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, $5,000 a month is measly. To be quite frank with you, it's measly.
Yeah. Let me bring it, Mr. Philip. You've heard Chester Humphrey there, spoken like a true trade unionist. Trade unionism is in his blood. He has gone to bat for parliamentarians in the same way that other parliamentarians have gone to bat.
I would not say that he is taking a trade unionist position. I agree with him on the question of his value, on the question of the value of the contribution. My argument is that in the context of a concern, a national concern about productivity and about workers putting out, I wonder what are the signals that we are sending, because it is not just the question of parliamentarians awarding themselves that increase. I agree that 5,000 is not a significant amount of money. In fact, it is at that border that you don't pay tax. So it can be regarded as being extravagant by any means. But when we have concerns about productivity and about performance and about implementation in the public service, and we award these kinds of increases, I believe it sends a bad signal.
No, but let's be clear here. No.
But I don't believe that we should focus the rest of your debate on this particular difference.
No. We'll get to
Senator and myself.
Yes, we will get to Mr. Humphrey some quick final comments before we get to the next theme of the conversation. Yes.
I also believe that if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. And I would like to have seen accompanying that some legislation concerning parliamentarians and public officials concerning corruption. You cannot be a parliamentarian and running thousands and thousands of dollars in phone calls that have nothing to do with the government business and things like that, right? If we, on the one hand, we are going to properly compensate these people for the value, as Chester put it, or for the effort, my argument was that outside of ministers, we are not talking about full-time positions. I agree that a constituency need to be funded, and this is another thing, by the way, I would not have given this increase across the board. I would have given a basic allowance for the running of a constituency office where you need a helper or two, right? You need telephone, you need electricity, you need internet. And that was the basic office provisions. I've come with a flat thing across the board, X dollars across the board for every constituency. And then you look at a further allowance on the basis of the number of constituents in that constituency. Don't tell me that South and St. David's, South St. George and St. David's, that have approximately 8,000 constituents each must get the same as St. Mark's with 3,000 and St. Thomas St. George scrambling to make 3,000. We're joking in that regard. Anyway.
Mr. Humphrey, finally, I want you to put a bow on this aspect of the conversation in respect of parliamentary remuneration.
I don't know. I would concede that Mr. Philip has very little knowledge on these issues because he was never a parliamentarian. But the work of a parliamentarian is 24/7. Constituents come to, I mean, I know it because I've been in, although I've not been a representative one myself, but I work closely with as a member of parliament, and I know what it takes. I know what it takes. So as I said, $5,000 really is a peanut amount of money, but it is better than nothing. And I really want to emphasize that members of parliament who are members of cabinet are not paid for the work they do in parliament. And the work that they do in parliament, representing people in the communities, people come into the homes for help of different kinds, resolving problems of different kinds, right? That is a 24/7 days work, right? And to be paid nothing for it is unconscionable. And I believe the government has done the right thing, and it has done the right thing by according all parliamentarians without distinction. All parliamentarians without distinction in the House of Representatives get the same. All members. So separate and apart, because in Antigua this happens, separate and apart. You see, when you're a member of cabinet, you're a member of the executive. You're a member of the executive. And when you get your pay, that pay is for being a member of.
It looks like I lost your audio there, Brother Humphrey. It looks like we lost Mr. John. Of course, in the private sector, you know, it does not function. Mr. Humphrey, we're having some trouble hearing you, sir. If you can log off and log back in again, perhaps we can get you going again. But Mr. John, you've been hearing the conversation here around pegging increases and emoluments and benefits to productivity. That is a baseline expectation in the private sector, and we should have the same for the public sector.
It is indeed, Dr. Bubb. Yeah. I would like to echo the sentiments. I totally agree with Senator Humphrey, but Mr. Philip mentioned something that is crucial, because it links to how do we now have accountability. The legislation needs to think deeper, and unfortunately, we tend to throw something on the wall and expect it to stick and spread. But it's time we understand that we have to think deeper into its effect. The point regarding the size of the constituency is well taken and should be well noted as a transformation, what you call avenue to improving the whole system of public administration as it relates to MPs and members of the executive, etc., and the work that they do. The private sector, as you say, that is a basic model that is considered. In fact, if we don't look at our activities, if we don't look at our expenditure, if we don't look at how efficient we are, well, we don't eat. So I believe in general, you would find that the private sector would support the move by the government to reward, or to maybe reward is somewhat of a strong word from that point of view, but to adequately compensate parliamentarians, members of the executive branch, for all the work they do. And likewise, the whole idea of peanuts and monkeys, you're right. Maybe partly why we are in this situation, because if parliamentarians, etc., were never rewarded for the work that they did properly, adequately, and there's a measurement that has to be placed on the quality of work that they do, then maybe our situation here as we stand, by not knowing where we're going or where we want to go, seems to be the result. And so I believe if more emphasis is then placed now on the quality of work that these people do, that ultimately will start to get closer to the private sector in terms of how we live and what we deliver.
I want to segue, Mr. Philip and Mr. John, until we get Mr. Humphrey back, because Mr. Humphrey is having some internet connectivity issues there. And I want to quote directly from the actual estimates of revenue and expenditure. And that has to do with medium-term revenue projections. And I'm going to proceed with sharing the screen here. Mr. Humphrey says he's back, but we're still not seeing him. But I'm going to proceed with sharing the screen and quoting from the report in respect of that revenue collection piece, because again, the government does need that revenue to function effectively in order for it to meet those expenditure targets that it's articulating. But for whatever reason, it's not showing up on the screen. But I'm going to go ahead and quote from it on page 20 of the report. It says the government's overarching objective is to strengthen the revenue mobilization and administration. In relation to the Inland Revenue Department, the predominant strategic objectives for 2024-2026 period includes improving taxpayer experience and compliance through digitization, strengthen operational effectiveness, enhancing workflow professionalism, reducing tax arrears and improving data integrity, as well as reviewing legislation to close tax loopholes. Mr. Philip, in respect of the government would appear to be hitching its wagons on having greater and much more, now that the tax amnesty is going away, having greater tax enforcement there to be able to finance the budget. How would you assess its ability to do that?
Kellan, the frightening thing
Yes.
about a tax amnesty situation is the...
Well, just pause quickly, Mr. Humphrey, you're back. We can hear you and we can see you now.
Okay,
Very well.
fine,
All right. Yes. Go ahead, Mr. Philip.
It
Sorry.
is the
Yes.
extent to which non-compliance is indicated. And we begin to wonder, what has the government, this and Mr. Humphrey's former government, were doing in respect of tax compliance? You were quoting from a particular page, and it is something that I also took note of from the budget speech. It indicated that as a consequence of the amnesty, some $23 million more was collected. But look at how many people that amnesty extended to. I believe, I can't find the figure in front of me right now, but it is 6,000 plus people. I mean, how many taxpayers do we have overall? If we include every tax account as a separate account, in other words, if Bob has a business, his business will have a separate tax structure from Kellan Bob and his personal income tax. So we're talking about what? 45,000 separate accounts, and we're talking about 6,000 of them benefiting from an amnesty of tax. I mean, something has to be wrong with us. What had been done before? That is the statistic that really worried me. It's page 12. No, not page. That's not, no. Page 12 has to do.
Are we looking at the medium-term report, or are you looking at the estimates?
No, I was looking at the budget speech itself.
The speech itself. The speech itself. Okay.
Budget speech.
Okay. I'm going to find it now. I'll do a quick spotlight search here, and I'll find it. But please proceed, Mr. Philip.
No, I covered that point.
Yeah.
I thought you were inviting Chester on something.
Yeah. Yes. And I'm going to bring back Mr. Humphrey here in respect of the revenues that would be needed to finance the budget, Mr. Humphrey. We're now talking about there is going to be, again, the increase on parliamentarians, which we discussed, the increase for the seed program. We're talking about increases in respect of the Imani interns. We're talking about the pension, ensuring that we can have a sustainable pension scheme, which must also be pegged against pension reform. Let us articulate how we are going to fund all of this against this revenue collection.
Well, as I said to you before, from what I have seen so far and what are the indications on the horizon, things seem to be pretty much stable.
Yes.
Some aspects of the expenditure is not sustainable too far into the future.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when the 1958 pension was introduced, the size of the state administration to which this pension referred was numerically very small. With the years subsequent, especially the years under the revolution, when universal secondary free education was introduced, the payroll was indeed swamped with large numbers of employees, which hitherto did not exist before. Pension reform had not occurred, and so you have a situation in which the current pension arrangement is not sustainable. But I would argue those workers who are in the system now and are beneficiaries of it, you can't take it away from them. But you have to reform. Mm-hmm. And the government has given no indication that I'm aware of that reform is seriously underway. There's talk about a contributory pension. That happens in most parts of the world. In fact, all private pensions in the state of Grenada, many of the islands that I know of, are co-financed with a contribution from the employee and a contribution from the employer. Right? But this is a matter that must be addressed with a fair degree of immediacy, because every day spent not addressing it means that you are adding more and more people onto the 1958 pension benefits list. Mm-hmm. All right? And as beautiful as it is, as happy am I that the workers' pension have been restored, at its current rate and level, it is not sustainable. It is not a sustainable proposition. And therefore, you have to make certain alterations and amendments that are fair, but that gives it the kind of sustainability. I mean, I understood the struggle in France to protect that pension and so on, right? But again, it has come to the point where these things are no longer sustainable simply because when they were put in place, people did not live that long. Medical science and the breakthrough in medical technology and others have now extended life well beyond 70. People are now living in the early 80s and so on. So life expectancy is expanding. The call on the pension resources is becoming greater and greater because people are living longer and longer. You also have to address the question of pension indexation to cost of living. Otherwise, even though you have a pension that gives you provisions for your old age, if there's not pension indexation, what you're going to have is large chunks of retirees who had already given valuable service and created wealth in the country will now be dished into poverty. Right? So you have to have a fair degree of indexation. And therefore, in that context, as the number of persons on the pension on the pension list expands, and as you have smaller number of people supporting that pension, you have to do a number of things as the actuaries have required in respect of the NIS, right? So, that reform must take place and must take place quite
well. Yes, Senator. So, in fact, if I may add here, in the budget speech, which I had the opportunity to read, I did not listen to it because it was also filled with some picong and mauvais langue there. But in the speech on page 11, it said that the new defined contributory pension plan, which will now guarantee a pension for government workers who previously did not qualify for a pension, will become effective in the first half of the year. No, let me go back to the previous paragraph where it says, the minister said, quote, I am pleased to announce that since the establishment of the Pension Review Committee in November of 2022, significant progress has been made in designing a new pension plan, considering key factors raised in consultation with stakeholders. And Mr. Brian Grimes, who's the president of the Public Workers Union, who is listening to this program today, he said the pension reform is on the way. Derek Osborne, a well-respected actuary, is leading on it. So I just thought we needed to add that context.
Yeah, but part of my concern too is the small numbers we're talking about.
Yes.
And that is also one of the challenges you have with private pensions in Grenada. The small volume of people you're talking about, there's nothing much you can do. I mean, the funds available for reinvestment, because this is what the insurance companies do. They manage your pension, they take commissions off it, and then you are left with a measly balance. So one of the challenges has to do with population size and the number. So I think a conversation needs to happen, certainly within the OECS, about pooling pension resources and what you're going to do with these resources. Where are you going to make those investments? And of course, the whole question of security. We've had an experience with a private pension provider, British American, and as well as CLICO. And many workers, I mean, my heart, every time I meet a member of the Cement and Waterfront Workers Union, I mean, my heart, tears come to my eye. I mean, these workers paid diligently into the pension fund, and today they get nothing. No one has gone to jail for what has happened to these workers. These workers' lives have been turned completely upside down. Many of them have been driven into poverty. Right? And those people who abuse the pension plan, live high off the hog, are free and moving around, while these workers in the age of need. In fact, had there not been NIS, a lot of these workers would be completely destitute. So one of the challenges and one of the things that we have to bring to focus, we have to strengthen the laws on the management of pension plans. Right? And that's exceedingly important. So two elements of the thing that we must pursue. One, we need to increase the size of the portfolio. So it means that we can't do this as individual items. We have to do this collectively in order to be able to get a sufficiency of funds to make sense. And then you have to have certified pension managers, and the state has to have the infrastructure to police these things. Part of the reason why CLICO and British American went away with our pensions is that the state failed to police this matter. It did not have the infrastructure to keep an eye on these investments, right? So, and these are the lessons coming out of that crisis. So it's a fairly complicated matter, but it is something that's got to be done. Pension reform is happening all over the world. All over the world it's happening. Right?
Yeah, Senator, we were definitely struggling with your audio. I'm not sure if it's a fan in the background or, but we're getting a humming sound there. So I just want to apologize to our viewers for that there. I'm not too sure what's going on with Senator's audio. But
song still?
Yes, we're still getting it. It might be something. Yeah. So I'm not sure what's going on there. But let us get to, we also lost Mr. Philip. But let us get to Mr. John, and then we have to wrap up, gentlemen, because we have to get quickly to the next segment. Big picture, in respect of how we mitigate against those external shocks that the Minister of Finance articulated in the budget speech. Mr. John, I want to begin with you. How does the private sector act as a partner in mitigating those external shocks that every administration has to take into account for the budget?
Kalon, let me just first start by speaking of something that Mr. Philip mentioned with regard to taxation. It is a known fact that the Grenadian government, there's approximately over $500 million in unpaid taxes in one way or the other. And that is principal and interest combined. Whatever the actual figure in principle is, I guess the experts have those figures. Having said that, though, to Mr. Humphrey's point as a segue into your question, we have very little infrastructure in terms of financial, what I would call financial services. A good example would be Trinidad. When Trinidad got independence, it decided that all banks and all insurance companies have to be 51% owned by Trinidadians. Now, this is not a unique issue. In fact, all over the world, Canada, Germany, England, United States, there's a great reliance on having financial institutions have a greater percentage owned by the people who it serves. Now, I agree with Senator Humphrey's point, and to segue into pensions, that given the size of our economies, if you add all the Eastern Caribbean islands together, and I have a pet peeve, I'm dropping the O because I think we're organizing long enough. It's time we become Eastern Caribbean Union, which we have all signed to and ratified that convention. Mm-hmm. It is important that we understand that there's some things we cannot do alone. We have facilitations from our NIS, but pension, it is important that we get together and pass the enabling laws to allow us to be able to do that together. However, the concentration on the investments must happen within the EC. There's a huge extraction of resources that is coming from the Eastern Caribbean islands. Grenada is no exception in terms of insurance companies, in terms of banking. And we need to put some laws around that to challenge and make sure that there are buffers there and it is invested here. Grenada has, on the PNC side, about 17 different insurance companies that operate here. There are only 2 local companies. And on the life side, there's only 1 local, somewhere 8 life and health insurance companies. The point I'm trying to make, infrastructure, business infrastructure, as I alluded to earlier, is the key, and financial business infrastructure is key to the operationalizing of what we will thus benefit from or sustain ourselves. Currently, just to comment on the pension issue, what is in place cannot be sustained at all. Mm-hmm. What is going to be interesting is to see how the government is going to have the either amalgamation of the current system and the new system. Somewhere along the line, we have to create one single pension, and it must be a contributory system. And with the people who have a certain amount of privileges now with the pension that is non-contributory, are they going to make a decision and say, okay, all of it is going to become contributory? And the matrix, the mechanics will have to be figured out as to how does that lead into the percentage of what you have was already there in the pot for you. But key, as Senator Humphrey said, we need to be able to have managers within the EC. We must take control of that in order for our future and any pension issue to be sustainable. It's important.
Absolutely. I'm not sure if Brother Humphrey wanted to add anything else. Yes, go ahead, sir.
Quickly to say, I understand what Mr. John is trying to get at. But remember, pension is a constitutional issue.
Mhm.
And for those who are entitled, by virtue of the status they have within the public service, you can't change it. Right? So this is
Yeah.
why I'm saying the people who have it have it. But for those who are coming in, this is an opportunity to make the necessary change that will make this pension sustainable. And let's be clear on this. This state pension is an obligation of the state to its employees. Right? It's an obligation of the state. So we all have to fund the taxpayers that are funding it. Now, there are some legal questions which are still unclear. I am not certain how these questions will be cleared up. The court have not pronounced on them because the matter has not gone to court. But I would certainly like to hear some opinions on that, because that gives you. All right, let me explain to you what I'm trying to talk to without going into any great detail. On its current trajectory, because there are two compulsory pensions in which public officers are involved, both by law and one by constitution. The non-contributory pension is a constitutional measure which they get. But the NIS contribution is a contribution by normal legislation, right? When you add those two pensions together, the income of the employee derived from those two pensions is 100+% of the last salary that the employee had. I don't know of any place in the world where that exists. I mean, good for the employee. I wish it was me. And I'm happy for all those who are getting it. That you are making more as a pensioner than you are making now in salary. And remember, the state contributes to both. In the non-contributory pension, the entire thing is carried by the state. In the NIS pension, I think the state contributes what? About the state contribution is half of what, up to the maximum insurable income, and I don't remember what that is, if that's now $6,000 or $7,000, right? They contribute 50%, you contribute 50%, right? And now there's going to be an unemployment component to the national security benefits. So the point I'm making is here that there are many workers in the state sector, public officers, who are going home receiving more money from those two streams of pension that they made when they was employed. I mean, obviously, that is an aberration, and obviously, that's an unsustainable situation. And this is why I'm saying there's a bit of an urgency. The question has not been resolved by the courts. The matter has not gone to court. And I'm not clear I'm not advocating anything. I'm just pointing out that this is a reality, and it's a call on us, the taxpayer, right? That we have to fund this. Again, it adds to the root concept that this thing is not sustainable.
It's not sustainable at all. Absolutely. Yes.
Deep fiscal problems, quite frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. So, panelists, what we will do now is that we will take a quick look at some of our viewer comments, and then we will come back. We will take a quick break and then come back and wrap up the program, because we do have Martine Powers. Hello, Martine. Welcome to the Bubb Report again.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Perhaps you can do another Washington Post expose on the Grenadian economy, finding the Grenadian economy. But we will come to you shortly there. So viewers and listeners, let's get to some of your comments, which has been animating discussions in on our various social media platforms. And I'm going to bring back Mr. Humphrey here. Let's see, we have a comment from Mr. Brian Grimes. Of course, healthcare also informed, as Mr. John indicated here, a lot of what the 2024 budget would entail. Mr. Grimes is saying the implementation rate for the 2023 budget seems to have been lacking based on the evident sagging healthcare sector. That continues to be one of the major challenges of any administration. And we have to be bipartisan on this. And I heard the leader of the opposition in Parliament articulate concerns about healthcare but we have to be objective and clear-eyed that no administration in Grenada in its post-independence history, well, perhaps save and except the Grenada Revolution, has been able to fix a lot of the structural issues that the healthcare system confronts. Let us get to another comment. Mr. DeRiggs, it's good to have you, sir. Good morning. He's saying this is a program where one can actually learn something. It will not have the numbers that the sensationalism of the programs highlight, but the discussion and debate stimulate the minds of those who are intellectually inclined. Thank you for that comment there, sir. All right. Let's get to Mr. Davis Joseph. He's saying, on the ground doesn't feel anything because I'm a man on the ground, and the ground doesn't feel the effect of anything when the bread and butter is under threat. So that it's he's saying that the budget is not really reaching the ordinary man there. Mr. somebody who goes by the name Summertime, who I believe is the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Finance. Mr. P.S., sir, it would be good to have you on the Bubb Report. We have tried to previously invite you on our program, but we were never successful in getting you on. We would love to have you on the program, sir, because I know whenever we have these conversations, you are an avid commenter in the comment section. We'd love to have you on the program. He said, great opening salvo, Mr. Ambrose, underscoring that the appropriation bill includes several documents. A simple read would avoid some of the comments I've heard since the presentation. All right, and that's why we do our research here, sir, to make sure that we don't engage in the histrionics that we see on other platforms. Let us get some other comments here. Let's see. Brand Grimes, what counts as employment? Heavy short-term work counted as employment may not give an accurate view of our national unemployment status. The numbers will fluctuate greatly. Mr. Philip, any thoughts on that?
No, I don't necessarily agree, because when you're doing employment surveys, there's a definition as to what employment means. Whether you would have worked X man hours or X man days in the past couple of months or whatever it is, just to clarify for that. But there's a definition accompanying each survey.
Mr. Humphrey, what counts as employment, looking at the overall employment vis-a-vis unemployment rate?
Well, from my understanding that the definition that applies, you have to be looking for work within a certain period of time. There are people who, for want of a better term, are chronically unemployable.
They don't want to be.
They don't want to work. They spend all the time sitting on the side of the road, or they look for income in a more lucrative part of the society. And don't underestimate the attraction of the macro economy as a source of income for substantial numbers of young people, especially the male. So, classic definitions, they have to be looking for work within a certain period of time. If you don't want to work and you have no interest in working, whether for yourself or otherwise, other than in the unlawful economy, you're not termed as part of the unemployed. But I get the sense of what Brother Grimes is saying, because that's well and alive in the United States. All of the economic data shows the U.S. to be in a healthy period of economic performance. Its unemployment levels are down, the amount of jobs created is down, but the average person on the ground, feeling President Biden is not relating to their needs. The average person, right on the ground, they can't see, especially as you face the storm with high inflation, although inflation is coming down. But again, it's how you measure that. Because inflation, the drop in inflation doesn't necessarily mean that the prices go back below what they were a year or two ago. It may mean that the prices are not increasing as rapidly as the first surge in inflation. But then it means that quite a number of people are not, from a point of view, they don't feel that the economy or that the benefits of the economy is coming down to them. And so that perception is a very real perception, and that's where the politics come in. Right?
Absolutely.
Come in, and it requires the political masters to spin as one would spin, because in this thing, It's a race to get votes.
Yep. All right. And on that note, folks, let us take a break, a mid-program break, and we will come back for some wrap-up comments before we get to the next segment of the program. Please stand by.
Can only hope that Grenada will benefit beyond the pictures, the videos, the sound bites, the social media pieces cut off Instagram. I know if it's Mr. Speaker. The government that boasts about having a youthful team has done the least to support the youths of this country, Mr. Speaker. To by this government, what? The Grenada Home Improvement and Resilient Project. Words. we have a simple, we simple people, we say housing repair. But big words, man. Tie up the head with words. The lawyer speaking. Good in the court, not yet. Mr. Speaker, so that one's washed. The devotion program of now is called what? Beautification, empowerment, sustainability, and transformation. Woo! Words, Mr. Speaker, words. Or special projects, they call it now community mobilization, empowerment, and transformation. Woo! Words, Mr. Speaker, more words.
After 40 years, if you're too long in the thing and you no longer have a positive, hopeful approach to life, give it to Pedro. But don't come with the doom and gloom. What this country demands and requires, Mr. Speaker, is hope.
Should your loved ones pass on, they deserve to be treated with dignity. And at S.A. Johnson Funeral Home, we can provide you with that service. We can take you every step of the way during your sorrowful moments. When that need arises, call S.A. Johnson Funeral Home at 347-777-9797. That's 347-777-9797. S.A. Johnson Funeral Home is a Caribbean family-owned funeral home here in Brooklyn, providing funeral services, but in a dignified way. From cremation to burial to the repatriation of your loved ones, you don't have to go through the hassle, as we provide exceptional service that allows you to mourn and heal peacefully. For more information, visit our website, www.sajohnsonfuneral.org. Send us an email at sajfuneral@aol.com or call 347-777-9797. S.A. Johnson Funeral Home, because you deserve to be treated with dignity.
Don't go there.
You are a technocrat. I mean, you can speak to whether or not it was appropriate or inappropriate for that to occur. Would you have done that as a permanent secretary?
Politicians get the information from wherever source that they can.
That's going to be the extent of your answer.
Yeah.
Don't go there.
There's a lot of noise around the data protection bill that, in my respectful view, is not warranted.
I was one of those making noise, and it's simply because I was concerned about that specific section 33.
Don't go there.
Are you going to be offering yourself up as political leader of the party?
I see you've called me have much more than diplomatic passports. I don't mind that.
Don't go there.
What is the relationship like between you and your leader, Dr. Mitchell, your boss, Dr. Mitchell?
I'm not sure how to explain how to answer this question at this time. I prefer not to answer.
Don't go there.
They said that you approached the bank for the loan before the election and that it only materialized after the election. There are also conflicting reports around the quantity of monies that were received. What is the reality here?
People try to extort the truth and to make all kinds of things about it. I just stay quiet. So if you notice, I was really and truly quiet about the whole matter.
Well, except with not with the New Today newspaper. The New Today newspaper reported on this, so I'm not too sure you were quiet on this. Go ahead, Honorable. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just trying to answer your question, right?
Don't go there.
I think we just spoke at length about the regularization framework. So
yes, we did. But let us talk, Prime Minister. Let us talk about the workers who are dismissed.
The Bubb Report. We go there.
And welcome back, viewers and listeners. At this point, we would get to our very esteemed panel of experienced and well sought out, sought after experts on matters of economic interest to the state of Grenada. And I would begin with you, Mr. John, for some closing comments.
Thank you very much. Again, greetings to the other panelists. It's very good to see you and definitely the audience today. One topic we didn't get a lot of time to talk about is that of inflation and its effects overall, given the standardization, inclusiveness of lifting that minimum wage. However, I want to put a point again, going back to what I've spoken of for most of this session, is that of infrastructure. Now, if we have a worry at all, it's not on the goods coming in and charging their relative duties, etc., and taxes, but that of domestic production of food. I can go to one place and pay $5 a pound for oranges and another place $2.50. We have a bureau that seeks to, in fact, it's not within its ambit. It does not have the legal teeth to treat with regulating the price of commodities domestically produced here. I think that is something that we will have to look into and make sure as part of our infrastructure going forward in the country to regulate the price of goods and services in the country. Economically, I think Grenada is in a very opportune position. We have to understand what we have in order to look at where we're going. I believe the signs are all around us, and it's slapping us in the face for a number of years, the land of perpetual opportunity, but we have our foot on the X and the brakes at the same time, never truly taken off because we don't give ourselves that chance. We don't understand, and we seem to have an absence of awareness of what we ought to do. Many times we do things for political expedience. Much of the discussion today is very fruitful, and it's not things that are hidden or there is some nefarious outcome that we hope to achieve. I think we all want the best for Grenada, but it starts with accountability. It starts for recognizing the infrastructure that we have to put in place to facilitate business. And as I said, the ideas now have to be determined, given our size, given our small size, how do we facilitate the rest of the world with what we have to offer? Look at the advantages we have. Again, health tourism, technology, even going back to your nutmeg, I take Mr. Phillips' argument well, and he's correct by and large. But there's some unique aspects of what we have to offer, including that of the yield in our nutmeg. Imagine that about 500,000 pounds of nutmeg is not harvested every year, and that's on average. Taking that to one manufacturing stage more, just one. We already have quite a lot of the mechanisms. What we don't have is simple technology that doesn't require digital transformation. Could simply be putting a net under the tree. I have to thank Grenadians for waking up and understanding that we cannot continue on the road that we have been for the last 30, 40 years. That this is a time that we have to understand what work means. We have a lot more certificated people. Unfortunately, I don't see certificates doing the work. You still have to do the work. Skills in this era does not mean just doing things with your hand. You need to know Microsoft suite of products and Adobe which is involved in administration. So when you come out of school with 12 subjects, but yet you do not have those necessary skills, if in fact is that you are in an office environment, either in public administration or in the private sector, the transfer of skills, the practical application of scientific knowledge is key to actually advancing our cause and ensuring that it's beneficial to everybody. If one sector of the economy grows, it pulls the others. And most importantly, the importance of the Eastern Caribbean Union. I don't think I could emphasize that enough. We are barely 600,000 when we put us together. Grenada is number 4 in the islands. Grenada was number 1 for years. Is it that the others are brighter than us? I don't think so. What it is that right now they're outworking us. And I leave that to our conscience to bear over. Thank you.
And I would add to what you talk about there in respect of what the education system produces. And Mr. Timothy Antoine, who is a Grenadian, of course, and who's the governor of the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, he made a very poignant point recently that we have this obsession with subjects. and you know, that is so profound in respect of where we need to go. We need to get rid of that obsession that we have with subjects. Look, I left because my grandmother at the time, she could not afford to pay, or my mother, who was ailing with cancer at the time, could not afford for me to take 10 CXCs when I graduated, when I did CXC at the PBC. I only did 6 subjects. And for me, at that time, it was a point of shame. But really and truly, when you look at it, I regretted not engaging in more technical skills, for example. Obviously, it was not offered as much, but you make such a profound point.
Just to add to that specific point, the UK does not allow its kids to do more than 8 subjects.
Yeah.
They do not allow you to do maximum more than 4 A-level subjects.
Yeah.
And that says that to focus on what it is your interests lie is important. We are not creating scientists and engineers. Unfortunately, we have more lawyers per capita. It is important to understand the Germany, which is the largest economy in Europe. There are more engineers and scientists coming out of there. Imagine that Germany produces more chocolate products. Well, Germany doesn't grow cocoa. But understanding the relationship and the business of business, Grenada needs to find its identity and needs to find its identity within the context of the Eastern Caribbean, not simply just to produce more hair, but to have the Eastern Caribbean as part of our clientele. And there is a ready market for that. Yet we have to harmonize our laws to make sure that functional capacity is there as a society so that we can produce more and by virtue of that, benefit more. Thank you.
Mr. John, thank you so very much. Well received reflection there. Mr. Humphrey, it's good to have you on the program as always, sir. Over to you for some final comments.
Well, I will focus back more on the trade union components and leave the economic, co-economic issues to Ambrose. Although I would say that it is unrealistic to expect that within 16 months, the government will produce a budget that is so dramatically different from what it met in office. I mean, I think the budget is technically summed within the context of how budgets are prepared. I think the technicians and workers in the Ministry of Finance are very conversant with what they do. And putting the budget together, as I say, one could not anticipate that within 16 months there would be this dramatic change. So I'm saying the stability that has been created and the consistency is still there. And as you know, as I said, new rules were brought in, laws were put in place in order to deal with the question of irresponsible administration. And that puts certain strictures. So that the budget is purely a routine measure. In respect to addressing the redistribution of wealth, taking into consideration the effects of, first of all, COVID, secondly, the effects of the galloping inflation brought on by the situation in the international economy as such. I think it was timely and needed. Remembering that the last adjustment for that level of worker was about 10 or 12 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, who could work? I mean, prices have dramatically increased during that time. And while the CPI may appear modest, but you must consider, first of all, there's been significant movement in the food component parts, right, of the CPI. And that is where most of the income of ordinary people are spent, right? So the impact on them is significantly more negative than if you look at the middle classes, those who have trade unions to protect them, public officers, etc., 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 right? So I think it's a good thing. There are some structural defects, and I believe that this new minimum wage did not take, to my mind, sufficiently into consideration the point that Rose made, the whole question of productivity. And the basic unit of measurement of the cost of labor cannot be days work, right? I mean, the basic unit of measurement has to be hourly rate. So everybody should be put on an hourly rate. You shouldn't have any days work at all. That's the most inefficient and reinforces the lack of productivity. Secondly, it puts a limit on how much you can make those adjustments. Whereas if it was all done on an hourly rate, right, you would find that you could have enhanced the package much more, because it meant that people can do several jobs within a working day, right, in order to beef up the income. The other matter in respect of the defect in the minimum wage is the discrimination in pay, which I don't understand, because I know it existed before and I criticized it on the last occasion. I think it was 2008 or 2010, whenever the last minimum wage was addressed. I criticized it then. And the then Minister of Labour, Mrs. Roberts, can tell you that I sent a long memo advising you cannot have this differential in pay based on geography. It's discriminatory. It's in contradiction to the principles set out in the ILO. We are signed on to several ILO conventions, Conventions 100 and Conventions 111. In our very laws, you talk about equal pay for work of equal value. If that is a universally recognized principle, how then pay is based on geography? Whether I buy a gallon of gas in Grenville or I buy a gallon of gas in New York, the price of the gas is the same.
Yeah.
Right? And the cost of living is the same nationally.
Yeah.
So I don't understand how you would say, and the irony of this is the following. There's a differential in pay for a bartender working in St. George. Right? In the parish of St. George, that has the most hotels and the more upscale hotels. But the parish of St. David is rapidly becoming one of the key centers of our tourism development. There are 2 5-star plus hotel ventures that are down there. So on that basis, therefore, because the rates that these hotels will charge will not be based on the geography of the country. So I don't understand how you give them the right to pay a bartender in St. David for work of the same value done by a bartender in St. George, right? To be paid less. I mean, that kind of discrimination really, it's, first of all, I couldn't understand what the reasoning was before. That, and secondly, as I say, it's a clear violation of existing law, and it's a violation of the conventions to which Grenada is a signatory. So as I said, these are some of the defects, but of course, better something than nothing.
Yeah.
And I say that in respect to Parliament. I know I'm not a beneficiary. I'm going to be writing for my back pay, because
you're retroactive.
I'm going to be asking for some kind of back pay consideration, because for 10 years that I served in the Parliament as President for the Senate or thereabout, we got no adjustment, absolutely no adjustment in our remuneration. And our pensions are based on that fixed amount, right? And, but I think what the government has done is fair. I compliment them for it. I think it is long overdue, and it shows that there's a recognition of the distinction between service in the executive, meaning cabinet, and service in the legislature, meaning parliament. We are two separate branches of government. And the pay for serving in the legislature cannot be used to say, well, okay, no pay for those who are ministers. That is absolutely really, it isn't correct. All members of parliament need that adjustment, irrespective of whether you're in the executive branch or not. Because as members of parliament, we serve as members of parliament. And it cannot be, and I repeat, it cannot be that a member of parliament who's a member of the executive is paid less, or it cannot be that an Imani worker is essentially a worker in training with no skills, right, is paid more than a representative member in the House of Representatives who's a member of the executive. I mean, something is fundamentally wrong with that kind of thinking, and fundamentally wrong at odds with everything that is fair and right. And I quite frankly compliment the government for selling that cap.
Absolutely. Mr. Humphrey, thank you again for appearing on the program. Next time we have you in the new year, we're actually going to be delving in on the geopolitical developments in our neighborhood, in our zone of peace, shall we say, in respect of what's happening with Guyana and Venezuela. So please look out for that invitation, sir. And Mr. Philip, over to you for some closing comments.
Closing comments. Well, first, specifically related to the budget, there are three indications inside of there that I would like to see further elaboration on, and in which I think that there is tremendous hope. To specify, one is the question of what is called greening of the economy and the transport sector and so on. There are indications there that there is probably funding identified or being sought for in respect of developing 17 megawatts of electricity. 17 megawatts, I believe, is approximately 45 to 50% of the total demand of the country. So that is probably going to have an impact in the long run on overall energy pricing. Secondly, the WASH program, the question of bringing water and toilet facilities to households. I would like the pilot to be carefully studied, because given the fact that this is Grenada and there are so many family lots and land issues, we do not want this to become a source of contention, but I believe the overall social objective is highly desirable. Thirdly is the question of the hospital project, where it has been indicated that 36 million was spent repurchasing land that once upon a time was significantly owned by the government, but we ain't going there. We have to look at where SGU has come from its origins back in 1975, 1976, under the Gary administration, and what it has done for South. I believe that with the right controls and with the right incentives, that a teaching hospital, the current location appears to be the Good Hope library, Baka library area. I would have preferred the original project site, which had been considered. I think it was somewhere in Hope St. Andrews, because we've seen the kind of transformation that took place in South St. George. I believe you can have that kind of transformation taking place wherever such a facility is located. However, we've not heard any announcement about a partner in that regard. We just hear about plans for spending preparatory monies in that regard. But if you look at what has happened in South, I believe that there is potential there. Thirdly, I want us all to give some consideration to the overall direction of the country. We've had a sustainable development plan to 2030, 2035. On the morning of independence, I was 18 or 19 years old, and I never thought that I would have been around 50 years later to see us having a 50th anniversary celebrations. But for those who are 18, 19, are living, young people now, what would they want Grenada to be like? What would they like to see 50 years from now? I think that now is the time for us to be able to make up our minds about that. We have to move away from any road will take you there to determining where it is we want to be, right? And to plan to get there. In that context, I think our objectives in this regard has to be the question of genuine individual independence. Individual independence. I fear that we have developed a culture of mendicancy over the years, whether that mendicancy is emanating from the barrel trade or it is emanating from one of the government programs. I would like to see a poverty reduction strategy. Right, when we're talking about budgets, I would like to see a genuine reduction of the safety nets that the governments seem to be beating their chests providing for, because it is expanding as every budget expands. That does not make any sense to me. With respect to there are areas that contributions need to be made. I would like to see a widespread introduction of means testing for us to determine people who genuinely need and so on. In other words, we have to become much more serious in the next 50 years than we have been in the past 50. The only example I could think of in the last 50 years that demonstrated seriousness was the example that I was closely associated with, that of the PRG in the 1979 to 83 period. I am not saying that the kind of militancy that may have been implied at that point in time is something that we have to go back to. But when we look at the US, Guyana, Venezuela stuff, when we look at the US role, which up to this week vetoed a ceasefire resolution at the UN for the people of Palestine, you have to wonder where your interest lies. And our interest, despite the number of diaspora we have in the United States, does not necessarily lie in the United States. If we're talking about self-determination, we have to be able to break the back of that kind of mentality. That is my contribution at this time. Thank you.
Mr. Philip, mendicancy, I'm glad you mentioned that. For in layman's terms, mendicancy, begging. the gimme.
Beggar in my neighbor.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. Folks, panelists, if you do want to stay around, we have Martine Powers, who produced a very riveting podcast, The Empty Grave of Maurice Bishop. We're going to take a very, very quick break and come back with our conversation, on a debrief conversation with Martine on her findings on that very interesting podcast. Please stand by quickly. Hi, everyone. Thanks for checking out the Bubb Report social media pages. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch our weekly live show, follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can catch repeat episodes on Wednesdays at 4 and 5 p.m. respectively on CRFM Radio and GBN TV in Grenada. We are also viewed on Sundays at 8 p.m. on WPG10 throughout the Caribbean. Thanks for watching. And viewers and listeners, welcome back to the Bubb Report. We are now joined by Martine Powers, who is an audio journalist with the Washington Post, who just completed her 7-part podcast series, Finding the Empty Grave of Comrade Bishop. You did give me an offer, Martine, in your appearance in October that you will return to the Bubb Report.
Yes,
so we can have a debrief conversation. And here you are. I'm so happy to have you back, because I'm now armed with so many questions, so many still unresolved questions in my mind, but which I believe your podcast was able to articulate and illuminate. So welcome back.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. And yeah, I'm glad that we can get into it now.
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, what has the feedback been like from the national Grenadian community in respect of your podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's been really gratifying to hear that people are listening. Apparently, this is the #1 podcast right now in Grenada, or the most listened to podcast in Grenada, which isn't that surprising, but it makes me feel good to know that this is something that has been resonating with people. But I also think that when it comes to the role of the U.S. in this question of the disappearance of Maurice Bishop's remains, I don't need to tell you or really anyone else in Grenada that like this has been a theory for years and something that has come up again and again was the U.S. somehow involved, or what was the responsibility of the U.S. government in this lingering mystery? And so I think my sense has been that it has been validating for people to at least get a sense that that there's a reason why those questions are valid questions. And while we don't have the exact answer of what happened to the bodies or where exactly they went, I think that the reporting and evidence that we uncovered, in some cases, like new things that I don't think people had ever heard before. In other cases, like going back to sources that had been, testified in court in 1984 or talked to students from Presentation Brothers College back in 1999 or 2000, that getting those people again and going into further detail with them, that it's all kind of created a stronger picture of what we do know about the events in that month after the month after October 19th and the U.S. invasion, and that is helping people understand a little bit more about what we know to have happened and the questions that are really legitimate questions going forward.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your podcast, I did, based on the eyewitness accounts that the people who offered the accounts in respect of how the remains of Maurice Bishop and his colleagues were handled. It would appear as if several people did see several, body parts at different points during that period before the invasion and in the period after the invasion. The impression I get is that the bodies were essentially in a state of decomposition. They were exposed to the elements in the rain. Then there was the attempted burning, and the campsite was bombed by the U.S. military. So the question is, based on what you indicated here, there is no way that these bodies were recognizable.
Well, that's the question, and I think recognizable can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and what was identifiable or not, I think is a real part of when the U.S. encountered these bodies. Did they know what they had on their hands? And I think it might help to kind of go through the timeline a little bit. And I know I don't want to go into too much detail because I know it's sometimes hard for people to process, but I think it just helps to get a sense of when Americans, or what we know about these bodies and when Americans encountered them. So October 19th happens, October 19th, 1983. And from witness accounts that we have heard, people who were at the fort, people who were at Calavini, we have these multiple pieces of testimony that say bodies of people who were executed at the fort were taken to Calavini that night, and there was an attempt to burn them. Again, this is not, I think, new to a lot of Grenadians. This is something that has been talked about many times over the years. The question is, how effectively were they burned? It was raining that night. We know from all kinds of people who've talked about their experiences that night. It was raining a lot. The ground was wet and muddy. So the idea that you could just sort of like put some gasoline on these bodies and set them on fire and be able to completely cremate them. And we know from talking to forensic scientists that cremating a body just by lighting them on fire with some tires is usually not effective. So it would have been partially burned, but not completely burned. And then after that, there are these like multiple stages where Americans come into the picture, right? So that was October 19th. Invasion happened 6 days later on October 25th. And then we know that a group of Army Rangers went to Calavini on October 27th. So this is day 3 of the invasion. And they say while they were at Calavini, bombs were dropping everywhere, that the whole place was in some ways like on fire, and that there are multiple accounts of Rangers who said they got into a pit that they didn't realize later had human remains in them, and that they saw bodies, at least at least one male and one female body. And the female question becomes important because we know that or that we believe that Jacqueline Kreft, the Minister of Education at the time, would have been among these remains. So they see the bodies there then. They are, I think, in some ways damaged. It's unclear whether they might have been bombed or not, and though we know that the area right around this pit was in fact bombed. And we know that these rangers reported it to the US government going forward, that, hey, like, we found some bodies here. We don't know who they are, but you might want to take a look at them. And that's just the first time in a period of several weeks where Americans keep going to Calavini and they keep seeing bodies there. So that was October 27th. On November 2nd, we have a report from, or an account from a CIA analyst at the time who was in Grenada. He goes to Calavini to check out. He thinks that there's going to be like evidence of the Soviets and weapons and what Cubans were doing there. He checks out this area. He says that he encounters a pit with remains in them, with human remains. He reports it up the chain. He's like, hey, you should go check out what is in this pit. Again, November 4th through 6th, we think that the temporary US ambassador at the time is aware of bodies in this pit that he thinks might have belonged to Maurice Bishop. There's a diplomatic cable on November 6th, which also talks about the US embassy saying, hey, there are bodies in Calavini that we think might belong to Maurice Bishop and some of his cabinet members. That's being sent back to the State Department in the US. And then it's not until November 8th that an exhumation happens and that these bodies that are in the pit are removed from the pit. So that's all to say that, like, they're again and again, Americans are encountering these bodies in this pit during this period. Were they identifiable? Were they not identifiable? We can't say for certain, but we do know that on November 8th, when these bodies were finally removed, there was a Jamaican soldier there, or a military intelligence officer, who has been interviewed in the past. He was interviewed during the 1984 pretrial testimony. He was interviewed by the Presentation Brothers College students in 2000, and we found him again. And he says that when he saw those bodies, yes, they were partially burned. Yes, they were like highly decomposed, but they were still identifiable if you knew who you were looking for. And he said that a witness at the scene was able to help them say, like, okay, that's Bishop's body. That is the body of Jacqueline Kreft. Eunice and Whiteman, he also remembers being identified there. And so there's a question of, could he be misremembering? Potentially. We've talked to a lot of people who, looking back 40 years, like, it's hard to, like anyone who's tried to remember something from 40 years ago, that your memory can be imperfect. But there is a sense of, if his memory is accurate, then what was there might have been decomposed and highly damaged, but still somewhat recognizable. And then these bodies go into the hands of the US government. And what happens after that? Why is it that they couldn't identify these bodies? And that's where the questions come up.
And, listening to your podcast, what resonated with me also as someone who works in journalism and who teaches journalism and media and communication is the amount of roadblocks you experience with the US government in respect of getting information, whether it is from the State Department, whether it's from archives, whether it is from the folks where the biological samples are stored. I mean, so many roadblocks, and you still have outstanding FOIA requests out. Was that the most challenging aspect of the podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that it's hard to know what is the reasoning behind these roadblocks, right? Like, I think that it is easy to assume that this is all part of this like grand plot to keep the secret. And I don't want to rule that out as a possibility, right? Like, I think that I don't know what's happening inside the US government, and perhaps there are some intentional attempts to make sure that the kind of play-by-play of what happened to these bodies at Calavini, that it doesn't come to light. But also, it's 40 years. And like, a lot of this stuff has been either dumped or through restructuring of different federal agencies over the years. It's like these documents that started with this one agency, went to this other agency, and then a third agency. And so we got a lot of responses that were basically people pointing at each other of like, oh, we don't have it, they have it, you have to talk to them, they don't have it, this other person has it. And so it's like that level of bureaucracy, right? That it doesn't want to be, nobody wants this to be their problem, is the sense that I get. And I think that's what's tough too, is like, is it things that were sort of intentionally classified and have remained classified for a reason because people in some positions of power at some point over the years said that they didn't want this to, or that whatever happened to these remains, they didn't want it to come out? Or is this just a situation where 40 years later, these documents are hard to come by and hard to find? And that, I mean, frankly, no one who's working in the US government today, or maybe a few, but no one that I've talked to in the US government was around in 1983 when all of this was going down. Mm-hmm. And so I think for a lot of them, it's like a big shrug of like, well, we don't know what happened. We weren't there. And that was definitely the kind of the response that I got from the State Department, where they said, we have no reason to have been involved in anything to do with Bishop's remains. We don't have the answers. But in part, I think that's a reflection of the fact that the people who were there at the time and might have known something that that they're not around anymore. And I also want to caveat all this to say that, like, there's also a chance that the bodies in Calavini weren't the bodies of Prime Minister Bishop and the others. Maybe witnesses were wrong on when we're talking about October 19th and where those bodies first ended up. There are a lot of open questions here, but I think that there's enough in the documents and the reporting to at least suggest that this is worth the US government to look into more. And perhaps not proof that they intentionally hid remains, but definitely enough that would say, if you found these documents, if you were able to get these people to talk on the record, like, you'd be able to fill in the picture more and provide answers for people who have been waiting for them for 40 years.
Martine, thank you so much. Each episode was extremely riveting. For me, very painful, even though I don't know anyone personally connected to that period, but I'm sure for many of the families, you've had challenges in interviewing, like, for example, Mrs. Annie Bain. I know that her granddaughter convinced you to interview her and stuff. But moving forward, closure, I asked you this question when you were here before. What would closure look like in your view for the families of Debrief, for Grenada?
I don't want to speak for them, because I think closure for a lot of them would look like a lot of different things. I think there are so many people who have waited to be able to have an actual funeral for their loved ones. And while I think the potential of reclaiming full remains seems uncertain at this point. I don't want to dismiss that as like, some people want to have remains to be able to bury, and that is what closure looks like for them. But I would say that for other people I've talked to, they want answers. They just want like a clear picture of, this is what happened. Maybe these bodies disappeared for some intentional reason. Maybe they were accidentally not identified. Maybe the US government had some or all of these bodies and they just weren't able to identify them because they'd been deteriorated and damaged. And I think that would be helpful to them too, right? That like, even an answer that's like, look, we weren't able to make an identification and we're not sure, but we think this is what happened. I think that would be a form of closure as well. But one thing I heard people say that I think is important to point out is just acknowledgement from the US. I think a lot of people that I've spoken to have expressed to me that they feel essentially gaslit by the fact that the US is like, what? Why are you asking us for these bodies? Like, we don't know anything about these bodies, when at least there's evidence to suggest that they encountered the bodies or were aware of the possibility of bodies. And again, we don't have all the answers of what actually happened. But I think what for some people, closure would look like the US government saying, we really looked into it. Here is what we found. Here are the things that were classified that we are declassifying now, to try to find some better picture. And that even a statement that's like, however we were involved, like, we're sorry it didn't end up in a way that would result in people being able to have a funeral for their families. I think that would be meaningful too. And maybe not for everyone, but for a lot of the people that I've spoken with.
Any final comments before we end the segment?
Well, I would just say that there's a lot more that could be done to try to get answers on this. And I'm going to keep reporting on this and pushing on it. And I know that there are folks in the US who are interested in this as well. In particular, we quoted US Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who spent some time in Grenada in the early 80s during the Bishop years. And when she became a congresswoman, she's been pressing the Department of Defense for answers on this, or to try to get more documents and information. But there are things that are out there that could provide more answers. One of which is there are tissue samples that were collected, that were brought back to the US from these bodies that were exhumed at Calavini. Those tissue samples, if they were preserved in the right way, they could be able to be used for DNA testing. And that could give you a sense of like, okay, the bodies at Calavini belong to, maybe one or some of the people who were executed at the fort. And so trying to get answers on those tissue samples is a big thing, as well as Earl Brown, the military intelligence officer from the Jamaican army, who I mentioned earlier. He says that he took extensive notes and also photos of bodies that he exhumed he was present for the exhumation. He says that those bodies, if you found those photos, they would show you that there were bodies that were at least partially identifiable, bodies belonging to Bishop and Kreft and others. And we have tried to get answers from the Jamaica Defense Force on this, and where are those photos? Do you have them? Could they be released? And they say that they're still looking into it, but that's a real avenue as well. I think that that if this Jamaican military intelligence officer is recollecting correctly, and we have a lot of reasons to think that he's a reliable source. We talked to his commanding officer. We've talked to other people who were around him at the time. We like those documents that Jamaica has, if they still have them, could be pretty big. So we're going to keep pushing on that. But my hope is that this podcast is also going to raise a little bit more energy around the need for those answers to come out.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for this, you and the Washington Post and your very extensive team. I was listening to your acknowledgements, and so many people who were involved in this project, including your senior, I believe is the producer, who was with you on the ground in Grenada. Amazing work there. And, we here at the Bubb Report, we followed intently. I heard myself in the first episode as well.
Yes. Yes. No, I was hoping you would be surprised by that when we played it, because
I was very surprised.
Hopefully surprised in a good way. But and I think one of the things that we wanted to do in the first episode, thinking about what's going to resonate for a Grenadian audience, but also what's going to resonate for an American audience, is explain to people like this isn't a thing that happened 40 years ago and people have generally forgotten about. Like this is still so present. People still have so much curiosity about this mystery and this like need for answers. And so I thought the interviews that you did, on the show, I guess it was October of 2022, we thought were exactly what, kind of painted that picture of why people want answers and why they care. Yeah, I'm glad that we were able to figure it.
Yeah. My aunt said, isn't that you? That's your voice. So thank you so very much again, Martine Powers. Viewers and listeners, if you do want to watch the podcast or listen to the podcast, it's on every platform. It's on the Washington Post website. It's on Spotify. It's on podcasts, Apple Podcasts. You can get it on YouTube as well. For those of you who
I think a lot of Grenadians have been listening on YouTube. It's if you're not a podcast person, that's like the easiest way to go. Is just go on YouTube.
Yeah, the easiest way to go. So for those of you, Colonel, I see you're asking some questions here. Certainly, I would go to the YouTube platform to listen to the podcast, because it is indeed extremely riveting, and every Grenadian should listen to the podcast. So, Martine, thank you again for coming back.
Thank you for listening, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Viewers and listeners, Martine Powers, she is a podcast journalist with the Washington Post, who just completed a very riveting 7-part series titled The Empty Grave of Comrade Bishop. She was here earlier in October previewing the podcast, and we brought her back now that the podcast is over to have a debrief on reactions to the podcast and where the future of that journalism goes, which she indicated here that Jamaica, having engagement with the Jamaican Defense Force and seeing what they knew might be the next step, more than likely will be the next step of her project. On behalf of the producers of the Bubb Report, it has been a long program today, but we thank all of you for staying with us and for sacrificing your lunchtime for being with us on the Bubb Report this week. So we thank you, and we will see you next week for another installment of the Bubb Report. Thank you, and have a safe week, everyone. Bye-bye.
Don't go there.
You are a technocrat. I mean, you can speak to whether or not it was appropriate or inappropriate for that to occur. Would you have done that as a permanent secretary?
Politicians get the information from wherever source that they can.
That's going to be the extent of your answer.
Yeah. Don't go there.
There's a lot of noise around the data protection bill that, in my respectful view, is not warranted.
I was one of those making noise, and it's simply because I was concerned about that specific section 33.
Don't go there.
Are you going to be offering yourself up as political leader of the party?
I see you've called me have a much more than diplomatic passports. I don't mind that.
Don't go there.
What is the relationship like between you and your leader, Dr. Mitchell, your boss, Dr. Mitchell?
I'm not sure how to explain how to answer this question at this time. I prefer not to answer.
Don't go there.
They said that you approached the bank for the loan before the election and that it only materialized after the election. There are also conflicting reports around the quantity of monies that were received. What is the reality here?
People try to explore the truth and to make all kinds of things about it. I just stay quiet. So if you notice, I was really and truly quiet about the whole matter.
Well, except with not with the New Today newspaper. The New Today newspaper reported on this, so I'm not too sure you were quiet on this. Go ahead, Honorable. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just trying to answer your question, right?
Don't go there.
I think we just spoke at length about the regularization framework. So
yes, we did. But let us talk, Prime Minister. Let us talk about the workers who are dismissed.
The Bubb Report. We go there.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for checking out the Bubb Report's social media pages. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch our weekly live show, follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can catch repeat episodes on Wednesdays at 4 and 5 p.m. respectively on CRFM Radio and GBN TV in Grenada. We are also viewed on Sundays at 8 p.m. on WPG 10 throughout the Caribbean. Thanks for watching.